But before all that, the first lot of prisoners to be released early from Scotland's jails are being freed. Over the next 4 weeks, between 500 and 550 inmates are leaving custody to ease pressure on overcrowded prisons. The policy covers prisoners with 180 days or less to serve from a sentence of under 4 years. It doesn't apply to people convicted of sexual or domestic abuse offences. Let's speak to our correspondent Lucy Adams, who's been looking at the story. So why is this happening then, Lucy?
So, hi, Andrew. So Scotland's prisons are massively overcrowded. Experts have been warning for years that that's the case. Earlier this year, the chief exec of the prison service said they're about to reach a point of crisis where they couldn't take any more. So they're talking about tensions being up, violence being up, prisoners being doubled up in cells which are only meant for one person. And the numbers have, in the last couple of months, shot up. And that's why they're looking at using these emergency powers.
Who is getting out of prison then early? What have they done? What have they done to be in there in the first place?
Well, so as you've said, so this will not include anyone who's been convicted for domestic abuse, for sexual offences, for terrorist offences. And every governor across all the prisons is able to have a veto. So if they know that a specific individual they deem to be a risk to public safety, then they'll say to them, you are not eligible. But many of these people, so they will have committed, some will have committed violent crimes, they will have committed driving offences. But as you've said, it won't include domestic abuse or sexual offences, but some will have committed some pretty serious offences, and they have to be eligible for release within 180 days to be considered under this scheme.
What kind of reaction then has there been to this policy?
Well, as you can imagine, it's been controversial. Opposition politicians have said we shouldn't have got to this crisis point, and that the SNP should have done more in the run-up because there's been so many warnings. And now some of those opposition politicians have argued that we should build our way out of this crisis, that we need new prisons, we need bigger prisons. But experts and academics have said that for years that's not realistic. Now, going back sort of over the last decade, there have been reviews saying what we actually need to do is make sure we've got the right people in prison. And that should mean reducing the prison population, not building more new prisons. So we know that last time these emergency powers were used was during the COVID pandemic. That was also very controversial. And that within 6 months of the hundreds who were released then, 40% of them had reoffended. So Victim Support Scotland and others have said this is really controversial because the reality is that whilst they're saying, well, we're just releasing very low-level offenders, the reality is that we could be creating more victims.
And is this an ongoing policy now that's here to stay?
Well, they're saying that this is an emergency power that they're using, but they've also said that over the summer they'll be looking at other pieces of legislation, including bail, and that they're looking at more of a sort of structural, long-term way of dealing with this. Because clearly, these experts are saying the reality is you let out 500 people or 550 people in the next few weeks. Those were people who were about to be released anyway. This is not going to be a long-term solution, and this is not going to sort the problem of overcrowding. So they need to do more than that.
OK, thank you very much for bringing us up to date. That's our correspondent, Lucy Adams. Let's get some reaction to that now. The charity Victim Support says it's actually aware of some prisoners contacting their victims, telling them they're going to be released as a sort of means of coercive control. And we can speak to Neil Moore, who's from another Victim Support charity, Petal. Good afternoon, Neil.
Good afternoon.
What are your thoughts on this policy then?
Well, although we know it's a situation where they have to do something, and it looks like they'll have to do something down south in England, Wales soon as well. And we're also relieved to hear that there's a criteria being set for offenders, including murder, which is the charity we support families and loved ones who have been affected by murder and couple homicide, that those serious offenders will not be included in this. But we do have concerns because, it will create more victims and that will be without a doubt. But the reoffending rate is very high. And that's the issue for us. The reoffending rate, and some of those people who reoffend, unfortunately, will go on to reoffend and either be involved in couple homicide or murder.
So do you think the early release of prisoners is directly linked to the risk of reoffending then?
I would say that yes, because there has to be proper risk assessments, there has to be time taken for that, there has to be support for prisoners being released with criminal justice services and accommodation. We know that it's a very dangerous time when people are released and they don't have support. And unfortunately, we've had people attend our services, their loved ones and family members, where there's been no support for someone being released from prison and they go into murder. So I think that that's our concern. And also the people who attend our services are concerned because it creates more anxiety and stress when they read something like this as well.
What do you reckon of this anecdotal evidence we've heard from Victim Support Scotland, who say that there were these cases where the prisoners are about to get out or they've just got out and they've actually called up their victims and say, hey, guess what, I'm out of prison now?
Well, that's obviously absolutely shocking that that's happening. And I think that's, again, it's the victims being part of victimhood again, and victims being preyed upon by people who are perpetrators of crime. That's the unfortunate thing.
What do you think the answer is then to solving this issue?
Well, there's a good question. I mean, we probably have the most amount of prisoners in Scotland. We probably have the most amount of prisoners in prison in Western Europe. That was some of the figures that we understood. The problem is obviously rehabilitation, having proper jobs for prisoners when they're released, but certainly making sure the right people the people who should be in prison, as we said before in the piece, should be in prison. And they should be in prison for the right reasons, as they're a danger to the public. And some low-level criminals may be able to, be out in the public domain if they're controlled with electronic tags and in the community sentences. But still, there is a big issue regarding many factors. I mean, I think there's a quarter of the people in prison, was nearly 2,000 people, are actually on bail and awaiting trials. Now, we know there's people awaiting murder trials for 2 years. And we're supporting people now for 2 years up until a murder trial, waiting for that to happen. So there's many things that's cogs in the wheels that aren't working properly, and I think that's all obviously going to clog up at some point.
There's one school of thought in all this, that if the prisons are full, then more prisons should be built. What do you think about that?
Well, this in hindsight, at this moment in time, we could do with another prison because we're actually overflowing. But I don't think that's the answer. I think we look to places like Norway and how their rehabilitation and their reoffending rates are really, really low. Apprenticeship schemes, things like that for people who are offenders. But for the serious offenders, people who have multiple convictions, and they're the ones that we're concerned about, because they will escalate when they're released, and they may well be incarcerated just now for less than 4 years, but they may have had previous offences, which may have had 7 years, 6 years, 8 years. They could have been serious offences, but they may well be released now because they've had a shorter sentence the last time they've been imprisoned. And just put us in the shoes of the victims or the survivors. I mean, how do they feel when perhaps a violent prisoners, they find out a violent prisoners who's maybe done something to them, attacked them, is going to be released early or is coming to the end of their sentence? Right, coming to the end of their sentence. Well, there is something called the victim notification scheme, which is run by the Scottish Prison Service, which would people who are being affected by murder and there has been a conviction, then the family members are allowed to know when that person's about to be released. Now, I hope that's going to continue and it's not going to be disrupted by this. But the fact of the matter is that that's the most stressful part for them after the trial, is the part where they know that someone is going to be released after their sentence. And although that's the natural way of things, as you probably think it, but with a victim who's suffered the loss of a family member, and they'll suffer that forever, to think that someone's coming out to then go on with their normal life, that's very, very tough. And it's re-traumatising for them. They come back to our organisation for support.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. It's Neil Moore from the victim support charity Petal. Let's also speak now to the advocate and senior lawyer Tommy Ross Casey, who's a former president of the Scottish Criminal Bar Association. And thank you very much, Tommy, for joining us in the programme. What are your thoughts on this early release policy?
Well, everybody who's released is a short-term prisoner, and every short-term prisoner is released early. I mean, short-term prisoners only serve 50% of their sentence. There is no risk assessment. They are then released unconditionally. So they're all released early. These boys are just being released a bit earlier than the norm.
Do you see a problem with this policy then? Do you think it's okay?
Well, I mean, they're likely to be fairly low-level offenders. I mean, if we had the prison space, I would be in favour of keeping them in. The reality is that we don't. And they're already committed to building a prison to replace the Victorian facilities at Barlinnie. So that only keep the prison population potential standing still by replacing an old prison with a new one. So to increase capacity, you need to build 2 prisons.
Do you think we do need to build more prisons then in Scotland?
No, I think there should be less people in prison, but you got a lot of talk about that, and it comes down to the brass tacks. It's hard to deliver it because ultimately there are so many moving factors in the criminal justice system, and ultimately it's the judges who decide who go to prison and for how long. And the judges and the sheriffs are completely independent, as they should be. So, the government doesn't really have any control over how many people are sent to prison. That's the reality of the situation. I suspect there are a lot of people there who shouldn't be there. But, sometimes there needs to be alternatives to prison. And in Scotland, there aren't many. We don't have halfway houses. We don't have bail hostels. So the result is there's, as Neil said, about 2,000 people lying in remand, untried, who are innocent, just waiting for their trial. We could start by trying to find alternatives to locking people up before it's even proved that they did anything.
Do you think there is a problem with rehabilitation and reoffending then with this early release policy? We heard from Neil Moore from the victim support charity was saying that they're concerned about this link with people getting released early and then going on to reoffend and then just ending up back in prison, maybe for doing something a bit more serious, and then the cycle just continues.
There isn't any rehabilitation. These are short-term prisoners who are locked up sometimes for 23 hours a day, sometimes sharing a cell with another person. It's a myth. There might be rehabilitation for people who are serving 20 years for murder. There isn't any rehabilitation for somebody who's serving 6 months for breach of the peace. And this is the type of people who are going to be released under this policy.
Right.
I mean, it's possible every single person will be released from prison eventually, and they might go on to do something serious. But that's just an argument for keeping everybody in prison for their whole life. And, we don't have the funds to enable that to happen.
What do you think the best solution is then?
I think the best solution would be to try to find alternatives so that people who are not presenting any dangers to society don't need to go to prison. That's a pipe dream. But as I say, really there has to be, it's not the sheriff or the judge's fault. If somebody is posing some sort of risk and there is no alternative to locking them up because the government isn't investing in bail hostels or halfway houses or rehabilitation programs, or we know what the problem with drugs is. A lot of crime is related to drugs. I think there's about a 1 in 1,000 chance of a drug addict getting a place in a rehab. Why don't the government do something about that?
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. That's the advocate Tommy Ross Casey. Okay, let's move on to other news now.